Welcome back to Mr. Nightveil. Tonight, 10 true smuggling encounters at sea that became something far worse. Names and details have been altered for privacy, but these stories are real, verified through crew testimonies and port records. From psychological breakdowns to supernatural curses, what started as criminal operations descended into genuine horror. Before we begin, drop your location and current time in the comments below. Hit subscribe if you're ready to discover what really happens beneath the luxury of cruise ships. Let's sail into darkness. Frank had been a senior purser for 8 years on a luxury liner, and in that time, he thought he had seen every administrative nightmare the cruise industry could throw at him. Delayed cargo manifests, misplaced passenger records, customs paperwork that did not match reality. It was all part of the job, the endless bureaucracy that kept a floating city of 3,000 people moving smoothly from port to port. But what happened on Thursday night, September 12, 2019, during embarkation at the port of Miami, was something else entirely. Something that would make him question not just his job, but his own existence. It started simply enough. Frank was in his office on Deck 3, going through the cargo manifest for their 7-day Caribbean route. The ship would be stopping in Nassau, Cozumel, and Grand Cayman before returning to Miami. Standard stuff. He was checking customs codes when he noticed a discrepancy. Container number HC47293 was listed as medical equipment, but the customs code did not match. It was a minor error, the kind of thing that happened all the time. Someone in loading had probably just typed the wrong number. Frank pulled up the digital filing system to correct it, but when he tried to access the container's file, the system would not let him in. Access denied. That was strange. He had clearance for all cargo documentation. Frank called his supervisor, Luca, who had been with the company for nearly 15 years. Luca came down to the office, looked at the screen, and shrugged. He told Frank not to worry about it, that it was probably just a glitch in the system after the recent software update. They would sort it out in the morning. But Frank could not let it go. It was his job to make sure everything was documented correctly, especially with customs. A small error could mean delays at port, fines, inspections that would hold up the entire schedule. So after Luca left, Frank kept digging. That was when things got weird. Frank searched for container HC47293 again, this time through a different database. The container appeared, but now it was listed as pharmaceutical supplies. Same container number, different description, different customs code. He checked a third system, the one used by the loading crew. Container HC47293 showed up again, but this time it was labeled as electronic components. 3 different systems, 3 different descriptions, same container number. The fluorescent lights in his office flickered once, twice, and Frank felt a chill run down his spine despite the climate-controlled air. Over the next hour, Frank found the same container number appearing in 47 different entries across various systems. Each entry had a different description. Medical equipment, electronics, textiles, machinery parts, food supplies, industrial chemicals. It was impossible. A container could not be all of these things at once. More disturbing was that each entry had a different weight, different dimensions, different origin points. Some listed the container as loaded in Miami. Others said it came from Shanghai, Rotterdam, or Santos. The timestamp on each entry was different too, spanning back several months, but all pointing to this exact voyage departing September 12th. Frank tried calling Luca again, but his supervisor did not answer. He sent emails to the cargo manager, the chief purser, even the staff captain. No responses. It was nearly midnight now, and the ship would be casting off in 6 hours. Frank decided he needed to see this container for himself. He grabbed his access card and headed down to the cargo hold on deck 2. The corridors were empty at this hour, just the constant hum of the ship's ventilation system and the distant throb of generators preparing for departure. His footsteps echoed on the metal flooring. And somewhere deep in the ship's infrastructure, he heard the rhythmic sound of machinery that almost sounded like printing, like dozens of label makers running at once. When Frank reached the cargo hold entrance, he swiped his access card. The light turned red. Access denied. He tried again. Same result. His card should have worked. He had been down here hundreds of times before. Frank felt his heart rate pick up. He tried the emergency override code, punching in the numbers on the keypad. The door clicked open. Inside, the cargo hold was dimly lit by emergency lighting, rows of containers stacked and secured with chains. The air smelled like ozone and something else, something chemical like fresh toner from a photocopier. Frank pulled out his phone and used the flashlight app to check container numbers as he walked down the narrow aisles between the cargo. He found where HC 47293 should be, according to the loading map. The space was empty, just bare floor and the securing chains lying flat. Frank checked the adjacent containers, thinking maybe he had the location wrong. Nothing. The container did not exist. But when he checked his phone, pulling up the manifest database, HC 47293 was still listed, still showing as loaded, still appearing in 47 different entries. Frank took a photo of the empty space, then checked his phone screen. In the photo, there was a container. A standard 20-foot cargo container, dark blue, sitting exactly where the empty space was in reality. He looked up. Nothing there. Looked back at his phone. Container visible in the photo. Frank felt sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool air. He walked closer to where the container should be and reached out his hand. His fingers touched metal. Cold, solid metal. But his eyes saw nothing. The container was there but invisible, or he was seeing nothing where something existed. The distinction did not matter anymore. Frank pulled his hand back and noticed something on his palm. A small piece of paper, stuck to his skin with static electricity. He peeled it off and held it under his phone light. It was a shipping label. Container HC 47293. Contents listed as circuit boards. Classified technology components. Destination, classified. And at the bottom, under the recipient name, it said Frank, his own name, his employee ID number. Departure date, December 15th, 2019. 3 months in the future. The lights in the cargo hold flickered. Frank heard that sound again, louder now. The mechanical rhythm of printers, of label makers, of some vast administrative machine churning out paperwork for cargo that should not exist. He smelled ozone stronger now, mixed with the distinctive scent of fresh printer toner, of paper that had just come out of a laser printer, still warm. The temperature in the hold seemed to drop, and Frank saw his breath misting in front of him. His phone screen started glitching, showing the manifest database, but now his own name appeared in multiple entries. Frank is cargo. Frank is contents. Frank is shipment. Loading date September 12, 2019. Arrival date variable. Destination undefined. Frank ran. He stumbled back through the cargo hold, his access card not working on the exit, having to use the emergency release. He burst into the corridor and headed straight for the security office. He needed someone else to see this, to verify he was not losing his mind. The security office was on deck 4, and Frank took the stairs 2 at a time. When he arrived, breathing hard, he found Camilo on duty. Camilo was head of security, a former police officer who had worked maritime security for over a decade. Frank trusted him. He told Camilo everything, showed him the photo on his phone, the shipping label he had found. Camilo listened patiently, then pulled up the security camera footage from the cargo hold. The timestamp showed Frank walking through the hold 20 minutes ago. But on the screen, Frank was not alone. The footage showed him talking to empty air, gesturing at nothing, reaching out to touch invisible objects. Then it showed him standing completely still for nearly 8 minutes, just staring at the empty floor. Frank watched himself on the screen, and his blood ran cold. He did not remember standing still. He remembered touching the container, finding the label. Camilo asked Frank when he had last slept. Frank said he had slept fine, had gotten 8 hours the night before. Camilo nodded slowly and suggested Frank take the rest of the night off, get some rest before the ship departed. There was no container HC 47293 in the system anymore. Camilo showed him. The cargo manifest was clean, no discrepancies, no 47 entries. Just standard cargo, all properly documented. Frank looked at his phone. The photo was gone. The shipping label in his pocket had vanished. But the smell of toner lingered on his clothes, and his palm still felt the cold impression of metal that should not exist. Frank did not go back to his cabin. He went to the ship's business center, logged into a computer, and started searching the archives. He found something that made his hands shake. 3 years ago, a purser named Ridge had reported similar issues on this exact ship. Containers that appeared in multiple manifests, paperwork that did not match reality, a growing obsession with finding administrative errors that led him down into the cargo hold. Ridge had been found by security, unconscious, hypothermic despite the climate control. He claimed he had been trapped in a container for hours, but security footage showed him standing motionless in an empty section of the hold. Ridge was sent home on medical leave. He never returned to maritime work. Frank found Ridge's employee termination record, dated November 2016. But beneath that, he found something else. A manifest entry for cargo container RG90451. Contents listed as 1 employee, destination pending, status, in transit. Frank spent the next 4 days trying to prove he was not insane. He documented everything, took photos that would disappear from his phone hours later, made copies of manifests that would show different information when he checked them again. Other crew members started avoiding him. Lucas stopped returning his calls. Frank realized he was becoming exactly like Ridge, descending into an obsession that everyone else saw as a breakdown. On the 5th night, September 17th, Frank made a decision. He went back to the cargo hold at 3 in the morning. This time, his access card worked immediately. The container was there, visible now, HC 47293 in bold white letters on dark blue metal. Frank walked up to it slowly. The smell of ozone was overwhelming. He heard the printer sounds everywhere now, echoing through the hold, through his skull. He placed his palm on the container's cold surface and felt it hum with some kind of energy, some impossible current running through metal that should be inert. The container door was unsealed. Frank knew he should not open it. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to leave the ship at the next port, to never look back. But he had to know. He had to understand what was happening to him. Frank pulled the container door open. Inside was not cargo. It was paperwork. Thousands upon thousands of documents, manifests, shipping labels, customs forms, all stacked from floor to ceiling. And every single page had his name on it. Frank as cargo, Frank as contents, Frank as shipment. The dates ranged from the past to decades into the future. He saw his own employee photo printed on labels, his signature forged on documents he had never signed, his identification numbers repeated across forms that documented him being loaded, transported, delivered, stored, reclassified, relabeled, shipped again. The administrative loop was infinite. Frank tried to back away, but his legs would not move. He watched as new pages began printing out of thin air, materializing from nothing, floating down to join the stacks. Each page added more documentation to his existence as cargo, as something to be cataloged and transported eternally through a system that had somehow caught him in its bureaucratic machinery. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The container door swung shut on its own, and Frank stood in darkness, surrounded by the paperwork of his own impossible shipment. Security found the cargo hold empty that morning. No sign of Frank. No container, HC 47293. The manifest showed he had completed his shift normally and disembarked at Nassau with personal emergency leave approved. His employee records showed 8 years of flawless service, final status, voluntarily resigned. But in the deepest levels of the shipping database, in archives that no living person had clearance to access, a new entry appeared and remained. Container HC 47293, contents: 1 senior purser, destination, recursive, status, perpetually in transit, estimated delivery, never. 3 months later, December 15, 2019, Frank received reassignment papers at his home address in Miami. The date matched the one he had seen on that shipping label. He reported to Terminal 4 as instructed, was processed through crew embarkation, and walked up the gangway of a ship he had never seen before. His employee file showed continuous employment. His co-workers greeted him warmly, mentioned how glad they were he was back from his brief leave. Frank smiled and nodded and went to his office on Deck 3, where 47 manifest discrepancies waited for him to discover, and the smell of fresh toner filled the air. Brindley had been a marine biologist for 17 years, specializing in coral reef ecosystems and conservation. At 41 years old, she had published dozens of papers, consulted for environmental agencies, and dedicated her life to protecting ocean habitats. But in March 2014, she took a vacation, something she rarely did. A week-long Caribbean cruise departing from Port Canaveral seemed like the perfect way to disconnect from work and just enjoy the ocean without research obligations. She boarded on March 16, 2014, looking forward to nothing more than sun, relaxation, and maybe some casual snorkeling. What she encountered instead would make her abandon marine biology forever and question whether humanity should ever have explored the depths at all. The trouble started on the second day. During a port stop in Cozumel, Brindley was walking along the pier, watching passengers return from shore excursions, when she noticed a man in his mid-50s struggling with a large duffel bag. The bag was dripping water, leaving a wet trail on the concrete. Something about the way he moved, furtive and anxious, caught her attention. As he passed close to her, she smelled it, the distinct brine scent of living coral, mixed with the chemical smell of aquarium water. The man, who she would later learn was named Sailor, was carrying marine specimens, and from the size of that bag, quite a lot of them. Brindley's professional instincts kicked in immediately. She followed Sailor at a distance, watching as he boarded the ship and headed below deck. She knew what she had seen. Coral smuggling was a massive problem in the Caribbean, with protected species being stolen from reefs and sold to private collectors for thousands of dollars. Brain coral, fire coral, elk horn coral, species that took decades to grow, were being ripped from their habitats and shipped around the world. It was exactly the kind of environmental crime Brindley had spent years fighting against. She found the ship's environmental compliance officer, a young crew member named Chloe, who seemed eager to help, and reported what she had seen. Chloe thanked her for the tip and said she would investigate. But that night, around 11, Brinley could not sleep. She kept thinking about those coral specimens, about the damage being done to reefs that were already dying from climate change and pollution. She decided to take a walk around the ship, get some air, clear her head. As she passed through the corridor on deck 5, she noticed a cabin door slightly ajar. The number was 5G, and through the crack, she could see the blue glow of aquarium lights. The same briny smell from earlier drifted into the hallway. Brinley knew she should walk away, should let security handle it. But curiosity and concern pulled her forward. She pushed the door open slightly and looked inside. What she saw made her breath catch. The cabin was filled with tanks, at least 20 of them, all different sizes, all containing coral, specimens. But these were not the dead, bleached pieces she had expected from a smuggling operation. These corals were alive, vibrantly alive, pulsing with color and movement that seemed impossible outside their natural reef environment. Brinley recognized protected species immediately. Brain coral with its distinctive maze-like patterns, fire coral with its toxic yellow polyps, staghorn coral that should have been fragile and dying in captivity. But instead, they looked healthier than any coral she had seen in nature. They glowed with an internal luminescence, and as Brinley stared, she could swear she saw them growing, expanding, the polyps reaching outward with an almost deliberate motion. The cabin was empty. Sailor was not there. Brinley stepped inside, knowing she was trespassing but unable to stop herself. She moved closer to the largest tank, which held a massive brain coral specimen easily 3 feet in diameter. The surface rippled and pulsed in a rhythm that reminded her of breathing, of a heartbeat. She had studied coral her entire career. She knew they were colonial organisms, thousands of tiny polyps working together. But she had never seen them move like this. Never seen them display this kind of coordinated behavior. The water in the tank was unusually warm when she touched the glass, almost feverishly hot. Below the tanks, she noticed the carpet was wet. And in the bathroom, the bathtub was filled with more specimens. These ones partially exposed to air, their surfaces glistening and somehow writhing. Brinley heard footsteps in the hallway. She turned to leave, but Sailor appeared in the doorway. He looked exhausted, his face pale and sweating despite the air conditioning. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then Sailor spoke, his voice hoarse and strained. He told her she should not be there, that she did not understand what she was looking at. Brinley countered that she understood perfectly. He was smuggling protected coral species, violating international conservation laws, contributing to the destruction of reef ecosystems. Sailor shook his head slowly. He said she was right about the smuggling, but wrong about everything else. The coral was not being destroyed. It was thriving. It was growing. And it wanted something from him. Over the next 20 minutes, Sailor told her a story that sounded insane. He claimed he had been a coral collector for years, supplying aquarium stores and private buyers. 2 months ago, he had taken specimens from a reef near Cozumel, a deep section rarely visited by divers. The coral there was different, he said. Ancient. When he brought the pieces back to his facility on shore, they began to grow at impossible rates, doubling in size within days. But more disturbing, he started hearing them. Not voices exactly, but sensations, feelings, an awareness that seemed to emanate from the coral itself. It called to him, pulled at his mind, made him dream of warm waters and calcium structures, and a collective consciousness that had existed long before humans walked the earth. He became obsessed with keeping the coral alive, with feeding it, with responding to its needs. When he tried to sell the specimens, he could not go through with it. The coral would not let him. So he was bringing them back, he said, returning them to the ocean. But the coral had changed him somehow, bonded with him in ways he could not explain. Brindley thought Sailor was delusional, possibly suffering from some kind of toxin exposure. Certain coral species produced compounds that could affect the nervous system. But as she looked at the tanks again, she felt something too. A presence, an awareness that seemed to fill the room like humidity. The coral polyps were all oriented toward them, toward her and Sailor, their tiny arms waving in synchronization. The humming sound she had attributed to aquarium pumps seemed to have a pattern, a rhythm that was almost like language. She felt dizzy suddenly, and the room seemed too warm. Sailor was watching her with an expression that might have been pity or recognition. He told her she should leave, should forget what she had seen, should stay away from the tanks. But Brindley was already too close. The next morning, Brindley woke up with a splitting headache and a rash on her right forearm. The rash looked like nothing she had seen before. Small, raised bumps arranged in a pattern that reminded her of coral polyps. She washed it thoroughly, applied antihistamine cream, tried to convince herself it was just an allergic reaction to something she had touched. But by afternoon, the rash had spread up her arm. The bumps were harder now, almost calcified, and when she pressed on them, they hurt with a deep, bone-level ache. She went to the ship's medical center, where a nurse examined her and seemed confused. The nurse said it looked like some kind of calcium deposit formation. Unusual, but probably treatable. She gave Brindley anti-inflammatory medication and told her to come back if it got worse. It got worse. Over the next 2 days, Brindley became obsessed with checking on Sailor and the coral. She found herself drawn to Deck 5, to Cabin 5G, unable to focus on anything else. She saw other passengers and crew members who had been near that cabin developing similar rashes. A cabin steward had rough, calcified patches on his hands. A woman who stayed in the adjacent cabin had formations growing on her shoulder that looked disturbingly like tiny coral branches. Nobody seemed overly concerned yet, treating the symptoms as strange but manageable skin conditions. But Brindley knew what she was seeing. The coral was not just alive. It was infectious. It was spreading. On the 4th night of the cruise, March 20th, Brindley could not take it anymore. She went to Cabin 5G at 2 a.m, knowing she would find Sailor there. The door was unlocked. Inside, the scene was nightmarish. Sailor was in the bathtub, surrounded by coral, specimens, and the coral had merged with his body. His arms were covered in calcified growths that looked exactly like the brain coral in the tanks. The formations extended up his neck, across his chest, and Brindley could see his skin had taken on a texture that was no longer entirely human. But he was alive. His eyes were open, and he was breathing, though each breath sounded wet and labored. The coral polyps on his body were moving, feeding, and Brindley realized with horror that his blood vessels were connected to them, that his circulatory system was now supporting these organisms as if they were organs. Sailor looked at her and smiled weakly. He said he could feel what they felt, experience what they experienced. The coral was not evil or malicious. It was simply trying to survive, to grow, to return to the collective consciousness it had been separated from. It had bonded with him because he had taken it from the reef, and now it was using him to get back home. But the process was killing him, slowly calcifying his tissues, turning his bones to aragonite, the same material that formed coral skeletons. He asked Brinley to call for help, to get medical assistance, to do something. She wanted to run, to get away from the horror in that bathtub. But she was a scientist, and despite her revulsion, she could not abandon someone who needed help. Brinley called ship security. Within minutes, the cabin was full of people. Security officers, medical staff, environmental personnel. They pulled Sailor from the bathtub, and in the process, several tanks shattered, spilling coral fragments across the floor. Brinley watched as the fragments began to die immediately, their vibrant colors fading to pale white, their movement stopping. And as the coral died, Sailor convulsed. His body seized up, his eyes rolled back, and he made a sound that Brinley would never forget. A collective scream that seemed to come from both him and the dying organisms attached to his flesh. The medical team tried to stabilize him, but his vital signs crashed within minutes. Sailor was pronounced dead at 2:47 in the morning, his body covered in calcified growths that continued to deteriorate after his heart stopped. The official report stated that Sailor had an extreme allergic reaction to coral toxins, specifically palytoxin, one of the most dangerous compounds produced by certain species. The smuggled coral was confiscated and disposed of properly. 6 crew members who had come into contact with the specimens developed chronic health issues over the following months. Calcium deposits in their joints, bone density abnormalities, chronic pain that doctors could not fully explain. 3 of them eventually required joint replacement surgeries. One developed a condition where her bones were slowly calcifying at an abnormal rate, turning brittle and porous simultaneously. Brinley left marine biology after returning home. She could not look at coral anymore, could not study the organisms she had once loved. The rash on her arm faded over several months, but it left scars in that distinctive polyp pattern. She still dreams about that night, about Sailor in the bathtub, about the feeling that the coral was aware and ancient and willing to do whatever necessary to survive. She dreams of cities beneath the waves, structures built not by humans, but by collective organisms with intelligence we cannot comprehend. And sometimes, late at night, she feels her bones ache in a way that makes her wonder if the coral truly left her, or if it is still there, dormant and waiting, a tiny colony that will one day bloom. Think about this. If something lives for hundreds of years in the ocean depths, developing its own form of awareness, what happens when we drag it into our world? Drop your thoughts below. Antonella had worked as a cabin steward for 4 years on various ships, and she prized herself on attention to detail. At 28, she had serviced hundreds of cabins, learned to spot problems before they became complaints, and developed an efficient routine that kept her passengers happy. November 7th, 2021. Started as an ordinary day on a Mediterranean route departing from Barcelona. The ship would visit ports in France, Italy, and Greece over the next 10 days. Antonella was assigned to Deck 7, responsible for 30 cabins. Everything seemed routine until she noticed something impossible in her assignment log. Cabin 7D had 2 passengers checked in under the exact same name. The name was Zara. Both entries showed the same age, 32, same passport number, same booking reference. Antonella assumed it was a computer glitch, the kind of duplicate entry that happens sometimes when the system lagged during check-in. She made a note to report it to the front desk after finishing her morning rounds. But when she serviced Cabin 7D for the first time that afternoon, She met Zara, a woman with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing a blue sundress, thanked her warmly in accented English, and asked for extra towels. Zara seemed friendly, normal, exactly like any other passenger. Antonella brought the towels, exchanged pleasantries, and moved on to the next cabin. 2 hours later, Antonella returned to Deck 7 to deliver room service orders. She knocked on cabin 7D to drop off a fruit plate that had been requested. A woman answered the door. It was Zara. Same face, same dark hair, but this time wearing jeans and a white blouse. This Zara seemed quieter, more reserved. She thanked Antonella softly and closed the door quickly. Antonella stood in the hallway, confused. The woman had changed clothes, certainly, but something felt off. The voice was identical, the facial features matched exactly, but the mannerisms were completely different. The first Zara had been outgoing and talkative. This one barely made eye contact. Antonella told herself she was being ridiculous. People acted differently at different times. Maybe Zara was tired, or had received bad news, or simply was not in a chatty mood anymore. But the uneasy feeling persisted. That evening, while cleaning the upper deck pool area, Antonella saw Zara again. The woman was at the pool bar, laughing loudly with a group of passengers, wearing a red bikini and drinking cocktails. Antonella checked her watch. It was 7 in the evening. She went back down to Deck 7, wanting to verify something. She knocked on cabin 7D. The door opened. Zara stood there in pajamas, holding a book, looking like she had been reading quietly. This Zara seemed annoyed at the interruption. Antonella stammered an apology about checking if everything was satisfactory with the room. Zara said everything was fine and shut the door. Antonella felt her heart racing. She had just seen Zara at the pool bar 30 seconds ago. There was no way the woman could have gotten back to her cabin, changed into pajamas, and settled in that quickly. She went back upstairs. Zara was still at the pool bar, still laughing, still in the red bikini. Antonella watched for 10 minutes, then went back down to Deck 7. She used her master key to quietly enter cabin 7D during a moment she knew the passenger would be out. The cabin looked normal. Clothes in the closet, toiletries in the bathroom, a suitcase under the bed. But then Antonella checked the safe. Inside were 2 passports. She pulled them out carefully. Both were Spanish passports. Both had the name Zara. Both had the same photo, same birth date, same passport number. But they were physically 2 different documents. And when Antonella held them up to the light, she could see they were both authentic, with all the proper security features. Antonella reported what she found to her supervisor immediately. Her supervisor contacted security. By 9 that evening, Antonella was in the security office with the head of security, a man named Valentino, who had 15 years of experience in maritime law enforcement. Valentino listened to her story with a skeptical expression. He pulled up the passenger manifest. Only one Zara was registered in cabin 7D. Single occupancy. Solo traveler. No duplicate entries. Antonella insisted she had seen it earlier, that there had been 2 entries. Valentino showed her the screen. 1 entry, 1 passenger. He asked if she was feeling all right, if maybe the long shifts were getting to her. Antonella felt frustration rising but stayed calm. She told him about the 2 passports in the safe. Valentino said they would investigate. The next morning, Valentino came to find Antonella during her shift. He had checked cabin 7D, only 1 passport in the safe. Standard Spanish travel document for Zara. No duplicates. He had also reviewed security footage from Deck 7. The cameras showed Zara entering and exiting her cabin at various times. Always alone, always the same person. No evidence of anyone else. Valentino suggested gently that Antonella might have been confused, might have seen the same woman at different times and mistaken it for something unusual. He said the stress of the job could do that sometimes, make people see patterns that were not really there. Antonella wanted to argue, but realized how insane she would sound. She thanked him and went back to work. But Antonella could not let it go. Over the next 3 days, she paid careful attention to cabin 7D and its occupant. She began documenting everything. Zara came and went at odd hours. Sometimes she was social and outgoing, attending evening shows and dining at the main restaurant. Other times she was reclusive, ordering room service and staying in the cabin for entire days. Antonella noticed the woman paid for things in 2 different ways. Sometimes with cash, leaving generous tips, and other times with a credit card, barely acknowledging service staff. The handwriting on room service orders looked different each time. Small details kept accumulating. Zara wore a silver bracelet on her left wrist in the mornings, but never in the evenings. She had a small scar on her right hand that was visible some days and absent on others. On November 12th, 5 days into the cruise, Antonella made a decision. She waited until she saw Zara leave the cabin, then entered with her master key. She went through the room methodically, looking for anything that might explain what she was seeing. In the closet, she found 2 sets of identical clothing, 2 blue sundresses, 2 pairs of jeans, 2 white blouses. In the bathroom, 2 toothbrushes in the holder, though singles travelers usually had only one. 2 different perfume bottles, different brands. The suitcase under the bed had clothing that seemed sized for the same person, but organized in 2 distinct packing styles. And then Antonella found something that made her blood run cold. A small notebook hidden in the nightstand drawer. The notebook contained entries written in Spanish, which Antonella could read moderately well from her years working international routes. The entries were fragmented, distressed. One set of entries talked about being held against her will, about someone stealing her identity, about needing to escape. These entries begged for help, mentioned a forced marriage arrangement, described fear and desperation. But interspersed with these were other entries in slightly different handwriting. Entries that claimed the first writer was insane, that she was the real Zara, that the other one was an imposter trying to take over her life. Both sets of entries referenced the same memories, the same family members, the same hometown in Spain. Both claimed to be the original. Both believed the other was the threat. Antonella heard the cabin door open. She shoved the notebook back in the drawer and turned around. Zara stood in the doorway, but behind her, also entering the cabin, was another Zara. Antonella saw them both clearly, 2 identical women, wearing different clothes but with the same face, the same build, the same features. They were arguing with each other in rapid Spanish. One was crying, pleading with Antonella to call security, saying the other woman was trafficking her, forcing her into a marriage she did not want. The other Zara insisted she was the real one, that the first was a smuggler who had stolen her documents and was trying to steal her life. Both had identification, both had evidence. Both bled the same blood when Antonella accidentally knocked over a glass and they both reached to help clean it up, cutting their hands on the shards. Antonella backed toward the door, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. She called security on her radio, her voice shaking. Valentino arrived within minutes with 2 other officers. Antonella watched his face as he entered the cabin. He saw only one woman, one Zara, standing in the middle of the room, looking confused and frightened. Valentino asked Antonella what the emergency was. Antonella pointed at the 2 women, described what she was seeing. But even as she spoke, the image began to flicker in her vision. One moment there were two people. The next moment, just one. The security officers looked at her with concern. The cabin had one occupant, one woman, one set of belongings neatly arranged. No duplicate items, no second passport in the safe. The security footage review later that day showed Antonella entering the cabin and appearing to speak to empty air. The cameras showed her gesturing at nothing, backing away from vacant space, calling for help while standing in a room with a single confused passenger. Valentino took Antonella aside and suggested she take some time off, that she might be experiencing exhaustion or stress-related hallucinations. He showed her the passenger manifest again. One Zara, solo traveler, no irregularities. Antonella insisted she knew what she saw, but her own certainty was crumbling. The evidence contradicted everything. The other crew members gave her sympathetic looks that said they thought she was breaking down. On November 15th, port authorities in Naples arrested Zara on charges of human trafficking and identity fraud. An investigation had been underway for weeks. Zara had been smuggling women into Italy using forged documents, stealing their identities to create new papers for her victims. She would bring them on cruises, then hand them off to contacts at ports who would force them into marriages or labor. The authorities had been tracking her operation across multiple voyages. But when they arrested her, they found no victim on board, no second person, no evidence of anyone else in the cabin. The forged passport they found was confirmed as fake, but the woman who should have been carrying it was never located. Zara claimed she was traveling alone, always had been. The investigation showed financial records of payments related to trafficking, but the actual victim had vanished. Antonella gave her testimony to the authorities. She described seeing two women, the identical appearances, the conflicting stories. The investigators listened politely, but clearly did not believe her. The security footage contradicted her account. No physical evidence supported the existence of a second person. Zara was prosecuted based on the financial evidence and previous trafficking cases. But this particular victim was classified as missing. Whereabouts unknown. Antonella quit her job 3 months later. She could not work on ships anymore. Could not walk down corridors without wondering if the people she saw were really there or if her mind was creating them. What haunted Antonella most was not knowing which woman was real. Was one Zara the victim and the other the trafficker? Were they both real? Was one a delusion? The questions circled endlessly. She moved back to her hometown, took a job at a hotel on land, tried to rebuild a normal life. But sometimes she saw people who looked too similar, who moved too identically, and she had to look away. Her personnel file from the cruise line noted her final performance review. Satisfactory service, but exhibited signs of psychological stress and confusion regarding passenger identification. The file mentioned she had been dismissed from duty after reporting hallucinations. Antonella knows what she saw, even if no one believes her. Two women, same face, same voice, both claiming to be the original, both afraid of the other. And somewhere, one of them is still out there, living a life that might not be her own or perhaps never existing at all. The question Antonella can never answer is which one survived, if either did, or if the truth is something far stranger than trafficking or forgery. Some nights she wakes up and checks mirrors, making sure she only sees one reflection, terrified of the day she might see two. Have you ever met someone who seemed like two completely different people? What if they actually were? Share your strangest encounters below. Catalea had been working as a customs inspector at the port of San Juan, Puerto Rico for 20 years. At 52 years old, she had seen just about everything that could be smuggled through a port. Drugs hidden in false bottom suitcases, contraband cigarettes, undeclared currency, exotic animals. She prided herself on her ability to spot nervous behavior, to identify when someone was carrying something they should not have. October 31st, 1998, was a Saturday night, and most of the other inspectors had gone home early, leaving Catalea to handle the late arrivals. A ship from Haiti had docked around 9 in the evening, and she was conducting random cabin inspections on crew members before they could disembark for shore leave. The crew member who caught her attention was named Lennon, a 45-year-old man who worked in the ship's galley. He was sweating heavily despite the cool night air, his hands trembling as he presented his documentation. Catalea had developed instincts over 2 decades, and every alarm in her head was going off. She asked Lennon if she could inspect his cabin. He hesitated, then agreed with visible reluctance. When they entered his small crew quarters on Deck 2, Catalea immediately noticed a large steamer trunk pushed against the wall, the kind people used for long voyages decades ago. It looked old, battered, with rusted metal corners and a heavy padlock securing it shut. Catalea asked what was in the trunk. Lennon said they were family heirlooms, personal items he was bringing back from Haiti to give to relatives in Puerto Rico. His story sounded reasonable enough, but the way he avoided eye contact made Catalea suspicious. She asked him to open it. Lennon fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so badly he dropped them twice before finally getting the padlock open. The smell hit her first. Rum, tobacco, something organic and earthy like grave soil. Inside the trunk, Catalea found 17 wooden masks, each one intricately carved with faces that looked simultaneously human and something else. There were ceremonial drums wrapped in faded cloth, bottles of dark rum with things floating inside she could not quite identify, and a leather-bound journal filled with writing in Haitian Creole. Catalea recognized what she was looking at. Vodou artifacts, religious items used in ceremonies. Some of them looked extremely old, possibly historical pieces that should not be leaving Haiti without proper documentation. She asked Lennon if he had permits for these items, especially the masks, which could be considered cultural artifacts. Lennon became agitated. He insisted they were family possessions, not stolen, not smuggled. But he had no paperwork, no proof of ownership, nothing that would allow him to legally transport items of potential historical significance. Catalea made the decision to confiscate the trunk and its contents, pending further investigation. As she reached in to examine one of the larger masks more closely, the overhead light in the cabin flickered. Just once, but enough to make her pause. Lennon grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. He told her not to take the masks, that she did not understand what they were, what they contained. His voice had changed, become desperate and frightened in a way that seemed beyond normal concern about legal trouble. He said the masks were not being smuggled for money. They were being moved because they needed to be fed. The spirits bound to them required offerings, and if they did not receive those offerings on the new moon, they would feed themselves. Catalea pulled her arm free and told Lennon he was not helping his case by making threats. She called for backup and had the trunk loaded onto a cart. Lennon watched with an expression that might have been terror or resignation. She could not tell which. By midnight, Catalea had the trunk in the customs evidence locker, a secure warehouse at the port facility. She filled out the seizure paperwork, photographed each item, and logged everything into the system. The masks unsettled her in a way she could not articulate. They were beautifully carved, but there was something about the eyes, the way they seemed to follow her as she moved around the room. She attributed it to exhaustion and the late hour. Before leaving, she arranged the masks on a shelf for better documentation photos in the morning. When she came back from getting her camera, the masks had been moved. They were now arranged in a perfect circle on the floor, all facing inward toward an empty center point. Catalea stood in the doorway, her heart suddenly pounding. She had been gone less than 3 minutes. The warehouse was locked. No one else had access. She told herself there had been a small earthquake, that the vibration had shifted the masks. Puerto Rico got minor tremors sometimes. But as she approached the circle to put the masks back on the shelf, she heard it. A low drumming sound, rhythmic and steady, coming from somewhere in the warehouse. She checked the building. She was alone. The drums wrapped in cloth were still on the shelf where she had left them. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a pulse that she felt in her chest as much as heard with her ears. Catalea quickly gathered the masks, breaking the circle, and shoved them back in the trunk. The drumming stopped immediately. The silence that followed felt too complete, too absolute, like the air itself was holding its breath. Over the next 3 days, strange things began happening at the customs facility. On Monday morning, 3 inspectors called in sick with identical symptoms: high fever, vivid nightmares, and the unsettling experience of speaking in Haitian Creole, despite none of them knowing the language. A secretary reported seeing a tall figure in old-fashioned clothing walking through the warehouse on Sunday night, even though the building had been empty and locked. Security footage showed nothing unusual, but the timestamp on the recording jumped forward by 17 minutes with no explanation. Catalea tried to focus on her other cases, but she could not stop thinking about the trunk, about Lenin's warning, about the masks arranging themselves into that circle. On Wednesday evening, October 4th, Catalea worked late finishing paperwork. The customs office was quiet, most of her colleagues gone for the day. Around 7, she decided to check on the trunk one more time. She needed to contact museums and cultural heritage experts to properly identify the artifacts and determine their origin. When she entered the evidence warehouse, the smell hit her immediately: blood and rum and tobacco smoke. The overhead lights were flickering erratically, casting moving shadows across the shelves and storage racks. Catalea felt the temperature drop, saw her breath misting in front of her. The warehouse had no air conditioning that could make it this cold. The trunk was open. Catalea was certain she had locked it, had secured the padlock herself. The masks were arranged in their circle again on the concrete floor. But this time, there was something in the center. A dead goat. A full-sized goat, its throat cut, blood pooling on the warehouse floor. The smell of fresh blood mixed with rum was overwhelming. Catalea backed toward the door, her hand reaching for her radio. The lights went out completely. In the darkness, she heard breathing that was not her own, heard footsteps that echoed wrong, heard whispers in a language she did not understand, but that somehow felt familiar, ancient, older than the Spanish or English she knew. Something touched her shoulder. She felt fingers that were too long, too cold, pressure that suggested a hand but did not feel entirely human. Catalea ran. She hit the warehouse door at full speed, burst out into the parking lot, and did not stop until she reached her car. Her hands shook so badly she could barely get the key in the ignition. She drove straight home, called her supervisor, and told him there had been a break-in at the warehouse, that someone had gotten into the evidence locker. She did not mention the masks or the circle or the goat or the thing that had touched her in the darkness. The next morning, a full security team investigated the warehouse. They found no goat, no blood, no evidence of any break-in. The trunk was locked, the masks inside arranged neatly, exactly as Catalea had left them, according to her documentation photos. The security footage showed the warehouse empty all night, no movement, no intrusions. Her supervisor suggested she take a few days off, that the stress of the job might be getting to her. Catalea went home but could not sleep. She heard drumming in her apartment, in her dreams, a rhythm that seemed to sync with her heartbeat. On Friday, desperate and terrified, Catalea did something she never thought she would do. She looked up Lenin's contact information and called him. He answered on the third ring. Before she could speak, he said he had been waiting for her call. He knew what had happened. The spirits were angry about being confined, about being separated from their offerings. The new moon was in 2 days, and if they were not fed, they would take what they needed from the living. Catalea asked what she should do. Lenin said he would come to the warehouse, that he would perform the ritual needed to calm the spirits. But she had to promise to let him take the masks after. No charges, no prosecution, just let him complete what he had started. That night, Saturday, November 7th, at 11 in the evening, Catalea met Lenin at the customs warehouse. She knew she was breaking every regulation, risking her career, possibly breaking laws. But the alternative was something she could not face. Lenin brought offerings, bottles of rum, cigars, specific herbs, a live chicken. Catalea unlocked the warehouse and watched as he set up the ritual space. He arranged the masks in their circle, placed offerings before each one, and began to chant in Haitian Creole. The drumming started again, that same rhythm she had heard before. But now it seemed to come from Lenin's voice, from the air itself. The ritual lasted over an hour. Catalea stood in the doorway, unable to look away. She saw shadows move in ways shadows should not move, saw the masks seem to breathe, saw smoke from the cigars form shapes that looked almost human. The temperature in the warehouse fluctuated wildly, freezing cold, then oppressively hot, then cold again. Lenin's voice never wavered, maintaining the chant with perfect rhythm. When he finally stopped, the silence was natural again, normal. The oppressive presence that had filled the warehouse was gone. Lenin carefully packed the masks back into the trunk, along with the drums and bottles and journal. He thanked Catalea and told her the spirits were satisfied, that they would leave her alone now. Catalea let him go. She watched Lenin carry the trunk out of the warehouse, load it into a waiting vehicle, and drive away into the night. She filed a report the next week, stating that upon further investigation, the seized items were determined to be legitimate personal religious articles protected under freedom of religion statutes, and the case was closed without charges. Her supervisor accepted the explanation without question. The customs facility returned to normal operations. The 3 sick inspectors recovered fully, though none of them remembered what they had dreamed or why they had spoken in Creole. But Catalea was changed. She found herself leaving offerings now, small ones, a shot of rum at crossroads, a cigar left on her porch, tobacco scattered at the entrance to the warehouse. Not because she believed, she told herself, but because she knew. She had felt that presence, had been touched by something that existed outside normal understanding. 24 years later, she still works at the port of San Juan, still inspects cargo and travelers. But she never confiscates religious artifacts anymore, never questions items that smell of rum and grave dirt. Some things, she learned, are better left alone. Some shipments are not about commerce or crime. They are about forces older than law, older than nations, older than the concept of borders. Catalea keeps a small bottle of rum in her desk drawer. On new moon nights, she pours a capful onto the ground outside the customs building. Just to be safe. Just to remember. Just to acknowledge that there are things moving through ports and across waters that answer to laws she will never understand. And the wisest thing is to let them pass. What would you do if you confiscated something that turned out to be protecting you by staying contained? Drop your thoughts below. Chiara had worked as a night shift engineer for 12 years, and she preferred it that way. At 39, she had grown to love the solitude of the midnight to 8 shift. The quiet hum of machinery, the sense of keeping a massive vessel running while everyone else slept. July 15, 2017. Started like any other night on the Pacific route from Los Angeles to Hawaii. The ship was 3 days into its voyage, cutting through calm waters under a moonless sky. Chiara made her rounds through the engine room, checking gauges and monitoring systems with the methodical precision that came from years of experience. Everything read normal until just past 1 in the morning, when her radiation detector started clicking. The device hung from her belt, standard safety equipment for anyone working near the engine systems. It rarely made any noise beyond the occasional ambient tick. But now it was clicking steadily, indicating elevated radiation levels coming from somewhere aft of the main engine room. Chiara followed the signal through narrow corridors lined with pipes and conduits, down 2 levels into the cargo section that sat just above the actual hold. The clicking intensified as she approached Base 7, a section designated for refrigerated containers. Her detector was going wild now, the clicks merging into an almost continuous sound. She checked the manifest on her tablet. Base 7 should contain furniture shipments and tourist goods, nothing that would emit radiation. Chiara found the source quickly enough. A large shipping container with breached cooling systems, evident from the pool of luminescent blue fluid spreading across the deck plating. The fluid glowed with its own light, pulsing gently like a slow heartbeat. She had never seen anything like it. The smell was strange too, not the chemical odor she expected from coolant, but something that made her think of deep ocean water, of pressure and darkness and vast, empty spaces. She called it into the bridge, reported the radiation readings and the leak, then waited for security to arrive. But when they did, accompanied by the cargo supervisor, their radiation detectors showed normal levels. No elevated readings. Nothing unusual. Chiara showed them her detector. Still clicking. Still showing dangerous levels. The cargo supervisor suggested her equipment was malfunctioning and made a note to have it checked in the morning. But he agreed to open the container to assess the coolant leak. The moment they broke the seal, the smell intensified. That deep water scent mixed with ozone and something else. Something that made Chiara's sinuses burn and her eyes water. Inside the container were dozens of cylindrical tanks, each about 4 feet tall, filled with a clear gel that had a faint blue luminescence. Suspended in the gel were specimens, biological samples of some kind, but unlike anything Chiara had seen in nature documentaries or aquariums. The creatures had geometry that seemed impossible. Their bodies, bent in ways that violated Chiara's understanding of anatomy, with limbs or appendages or something that branched at angles that made her head hurt to look at directly. They had a translucent quality, like they existed partially in the physical space and partially somewhere else. The cargo supervisor called them deep-sea specimens, probably from some research expedition, likely classified government work. He seemed nervous, eager to reseal the container and mark it for immediate inspection by specialists at the next port. But Chiara could not look away. One of the specimens had what might have been eyes or sensors, or organs of perception, and they were oriented toward her. Security sealed the container and posted a guard. Kiara returned to her normal duties, but a radiation detector continued to click whenever she got within 50 feet of Bay 7. The other engineers thought she was being paranoid, suggested she replace the batteries in her detector, made jokes about her seeing things in the middle of the night. But over the next 3 hours, Kiara noticed something disturbing. The temperature in the aft cargo section was dropping. Not by a lot, but by enough that she could see her breath when she exhaled. The ship's environmental controls showed normal temperatures. Her handheld thermometer showed 53 degrees, a 20-degree discrepancy. At 4 in the morning, Kiara went back to Bay 7. She told herself she was checking the environmental systems, making sure the temperature anomaly was not causing problems with other cargo. But truthfully, she needed to see those specimens again. She needed to understand what they were. The guard outside the container had left his post, probably for a bathroom break. Kiara approached the container door. The blue fluid was still leaking, had spread further across the deck, despite efforts to contain it. She knelt down and touched it. The fluid was warm, almost hot, completely contradicting the cold air temperature. It had a viscosity like honey, but moved across her fingers with a life of its own, seeming to crawl up her hand before she jerked away and wiped it on her coveralls. That was when Kiara heard it. Not a sound exactly, but a sensation of sound, a frequency that bypassed her ears and went straight into her brain. It felt like the pressure of deep water, like the vertigo of falling through infinite space, like the loneliness of being the only conscious thing in a void that stretched forever. She staggered back from the container, her hands pressed to her temples. Images flooded her mind. Darkness deeper than any ocean trench. Life forms that had existed for millions of years in places humans could never survive. Intelligence that was collective and ancient and utterly alien. The specimens were not dead. They were not even really contained. They were in some kind of stasis, and they were aware of her. Kiara ran from the cargo bay, back up to the main engine room where the familiar sounds of machinery and the heat of the generators felt like sanctuary. She tried to convince herself she had experienced some kind of panic attack, maybe oxygen deprivation, maybe contamination from that blue fluid. But the feeling persisted. She could still sense them down there, could feel their awareness like pressure against her mind. Over the next 2 hours, she researched deep-sea mining operations, classified research projects, anything that might explain what she had seen. She found references to expeditions drilling at depths below 20,000 feet, into regions of the ocean where the pressure would crush any normal submersible. Some of the specimens, she realized, came from depths where life should not exist, according to conventional science. At 6:30 in the morning, Kiara made a decision. She went to the environmental control station and rerouted the fire suppression system for Bay 7. Instead of deploying foam or gas, she configured it to flood the section with seawater from the ship's ballast system. Then she triggered it manually, overriding the safety protocols with her engineering credentials. Alarms blared throughout the cargo section. Seawater poured into Bay 7 at thousands of gallons per minute. Kiara watched on the monitors as the water level rose, as the container was submerged, as the specimens in their gel-filled tanks were surrounded by the ocean they came from. The frequency in her head changed. It became a song or a scream, or something that encompassed both. Kiara felt it in her bones, felt her nose start to bleed, felt her stomach heave. The sensation lasted maybe 30 seconds, but felt like hours. And then it stopped. The pressure in her mind released. The awareness that had been watching her, studying her, was gone. Or not gone, she realized, but returned to where it belonged. The specimens had dissolved into the seawater, their impossible bodies breaking down into something that looked like oil and light. Something that flowed through the drainage systems and back into the ocean outside the ship's hull. The tanks in the container were empty. The blue fluid had mixed with the seawater and vanished. Security arrived within minutes, demanding to know why she had flooded a cargo bay and destroyed valuable research specimens. Kiara told them about the radiation, the temperature anomalies, the breach in the containment. She said she believed the specimens were toxic, possibly biohazardous, and that flooding the bay was a containment protocol. Her story fell apart quickly under questioning. Other engineers confirmed there were no temperature anomalies, no radiation spikes. The cargo supervisor produced documentation showing the specimens were legally acquired from a deep-sea research operation, properly permitted and worth over $2 million. The insurance investigation would take months. What they did find, eventually, was evidence of an illegal smuggling operation. The research company that owned the specimens had been drilling in unauthorized zones, taking samples from protected deep-sea ecosystems without permits. They were transporting the specimens to a private biotech facility that wanted to study their unique cellular structures, possibly for pharmaceutical applications. 4 crew members had been bribed to facilitate the transport and ensure the containers avoided certain inspections. All 4 of those crew members, within a week of the specimens being destroyed, began exhibiting strange psychological symptoms. They reported hearing sounds that were not there, feeling pressure in their heads, experiencing vertigo and dissociation. One claimed she could hear the ocean calling to her. Another stopped being able to sleep unless he was submerged in water. Kiara was cleared of any criminal wrongdoing. The investigation ruled her actions as equipment malfunction and operator error rather than intentional sabotage. But she was quietly let go from her position 3 months later, listed as voluntary resignation for personal reasons. She never worked at sea again. She moved to Arizona, to a city as far from any ocean as she could find, surrounded by desert and dry air and endless sky. But the dreams never stopped. She dreams of those specimens, of their impossible anatomy, of the intelligence she felt pressing against her mind. She dreams of the deep places in the ocean where they came from, trenches and vents and darkness that has existed since before complex life evolved on land. Sometimes Kiara wonders if she really destroyed them by flooding the bay, or if they allowed her to believe she did. Sometimes she thinks about those 4 crew members who went mad, and she wonders if they touched the specimens too, if they felt what she felt. Sometimes, late at night, she still senses that pressure, that awareness, like something vast and ancient, is still watching her from the deepest parts of the ocean. She keeps her apartment on the 3rd floor, never the ground level. She avoids swimming pools and bathtubs. She showers quickly and keeps her eyes closed. Because she knows now that there are things in the deep ocean, things that have been there longer than human civilization, things that have their own form of consciousness. And she knows that some of them are still down there, still waiting, still aware. The radiation detector she kept from that night still clicks sometimes, even though she replaced the batteries, even though she is hundreds of miles from any ocean. She keeps it in a drawer, wrapped in aluminum foil, buried under clothes. But on certain nights, when the air pressure drops or when she is particularly tired, she can hear it clicking through the drawer, through the fabric, counting something she cannot see but can always feel. If something has lived in complete darkness for millions of years, does it see us the way we see them? Leave your thoughts below. Rome worked as a security officer on a major cruise line, and at 31 years old, with 2 years of maritime security experience, she thought she had developed a good sense for when something was off. February 8, 2020, was a Saturday, and her shift ran from 4 in the afternoon until midnight. The ship was on a Caribbean route from Miami to Nassau, carrying just over 2,000 passengers. Rome's duties included monitoring cameras, conducting patrols, and responding to incidents. Most nights were routine. Lost room keys, minor medical calls, occasionally breaking up arguments between drunk passengers. But that night would be different in ways that still make her question her own memory and sanity. At 6:47 in the evening, Rome was walking the pool deck when she noticed a passenger acting suspiciously. The man, who she would later identify from his cruise card as Damon, was 28 years old and traveling alone. He was standing near the aft railing, looking around nervously before accepting what appeared to be a small package from another passenger. The exchange was quick, practiced, exactly the kind of behavior Rome had been trained to spot. She approached, identified herself as security, and asked both men to come with her to the security office. The second passenger immediately fled, disappearing into the crowd. Damon remained, too surprised to run. In the security office, Rome processed him according to standard procedure. She had him empty his pockets, found 2 small bags of white powder that field-tested positive for cocaine. Total weight was just under 2 kilograms. Damon remained silent during processing, refused to answer questions, stared at the floor with an expression that seemed more resigned than afraid. Rome documented everything, took photographs, filled out the incident report, and escorted him to the holding cell at 8:13 in the evening. She locked the cell door herself, double-checked it, then returned to her patrol duties. The ship would arrive in Nassau the next morning, where Damon would be turned over to Bahamian authorities. At 9 o'clock, Rome was back on the pool deck, collecting witness statements about the drug transaction. She was interviewing a family who had been sitting near the railing when she saw him. Damon, standing in the exact same spot where she had arrested him an hour ago, wearing the same clothes, making the same nervous gestures. He was accepting a package from the same passenger who had fled earlier. Rome felt her stomach drop. She excused herself from the interview and called for backup on her radio, then approached Damon again. When she grabbed his arm, he looked at her with genuine confusion, asked what she wanted, claimed he had not done anything wrong. Rome brought him to the security office again. Her supervisor, Dorian, was there reviewing paperwork. He looked up as Rome entered with Damon. She explained what had happened, that this was the second arrest of the same person in 2 hours. Dorian seemed confused. He checked the logs. There was no record of any arrest at 6:47, no incident report filed, no processing documentation. Rome insisted she had brought Damon in earlier, had field-tested the drugs, had locked him in the holding cell. Dorian walked with her to the cells. They were empty. All 3 holding cells stood vacant, doors unlocked, no sign anyone had been detained that evening. Rome felt panic rising in her chest. She pulled up the security camera footage on the office monitors, scrolling back to 6:47. The video showed the pool deck at that time. It showed Rome standing there alone, her hands positioned as if gripping someone's arm, but gripping only air. The footage showed her speaking to nobody, walking through the ship corridors with empty space beside her, entering the security office and appearing to process an invisible person. She watched herself on camera fill out paperwork while talking to an empty chair, watched herself escort nothing to the holding cells, watched herself lock an empty cell and walk away. Dorian asked if she was feeling all right. Rome did not know how to answer. She could remember every detail of that first arrest, the weight of Damon's arm in her grip, the smell of the cocaine, the sound of his breathing, the way he had avoided eye contact. But the evidence said it never happened. Dorian suggested she take a 15-minute break, get some water, maybe step outside for fresh air. Rome agreed, too shaken to argue. She went to the crew deck, splashed cold water on her face, tried to make sense of what was happening. The taste of adrenaline was still sharp in her mouth from the arrest. The muscle memory of clicking handcuffs was still in her fingers. It had been real. At 9:45, Rome returned to duty. She avoided the pool deck, worked the indoor corridors instead, tried to focus on routine tasks. But at 10:30, she got a call on her radio. Disturbance on the pool deck. When she arrived, there was Damon again, in the same location, making the same drug exchange. Rome arrested him for what felt like the third time. She brought him to the security office, documented everything with meticulous detail, made sure Dorian witnessed the entire process. They field tested the cocaine together. Positive. 2 kilograms. Rome filed the report on the computer with Dorian standing right there, watching her type. They escorted Damon to the holding cell together at 11:03 in the evening. Rome stayed in the security office, watching the monitors. The holding cell camera showed Damon sitting on the bench, head in his hands. Dorian reviewed the incident report, confirmed everything was documented correctly, then left to conduct his own patrol. Rome sat alone in the office, her eyes fixed on the monitor showing the holding cell. At 11:47, as she watched, Damon simply vanished. One moment he was sitting on the bench. The next moment, the cell was empty. The camera did not glitch. There was no blur or distortion. He was there, and then he was not. Rome ran to the holding cells. Empty. She checked all 3. Nothing. She pulled up the footage, rewound it, watched it again. At 11:47 exactly, Damon disappeared from the frame. But then she noticed something else. Her radio crackled with her own voice, calling in the first arrest, the one from 6:47. She looked at the monitor showing the pool deck. There she was, approaching Damon, grabbing his arm, making the arrest. Rome stood in the security office, watching herself on multiple monitors at multiple times, all processing the same suspect, all filing the same report, all locking him in the same cell. She checked her incident reports. Only one existed in the system, filed at 6:47 in the evening. But she remembered filing it 3 times. She looked at her watch. It was 11:51. She picked up the phone to call Dorian, but before she could dial, the security office door opened. Damon walked in, not as a suspect, but calmly, deliberately. He looked at Rome with an expression that might have been pity. He told her she was the one who was stuck, not him. He said she had been arresting him over and over, that from his perspective, he had watched her loop through the same actions 7 times now. Rome tried to detain him, but he held up his hands in a gesture of peace. He explained that he was not supposed to be on this ship. He had boarded using false credentials, was part of a smuggling operation, but something had gone wrong. When she arrested him the first time, something had broken. Time or reality or causation, he did not know which. But now they were both caught in it. Every arrest reset the timeline for her, but he retained his memories. He had experienced this loop 7 times from different angles. Watching Rome go through the same motions, seeing her confusion grow each iteration. Rome asked him what happened to the cocaine, to the evidence. Damon said it was never real, or it was real once, but stopped existing after the first loop. He showed her his pockets. Empty. He said the other passenger, the one who had given him the drugs, was not real either. just a phantom of the first timeline, repeating actions that had already happened. Rome demanded to know how to stop it. Damon said he did not know. He had tried everything: running, confessing, jumping overboard. Nothing worked. The loop always reset at midnight. Rome looked at the clock. 11:56. She told Damon they were going to the holding cell together, that she was going to stay there with him, that when midnight struck, she would see what happened. They walked to the cells. Rome did not handcuff him. They sat together on opposite benches, watching each other in the fluorescent light. Rome's radio crackled with voices, routine patrol reports from other officers. The ship hummed with its constant machinery. 11:59. Damon told her she had been kind to him, efficient but not cruel, in all 7 arrests. He hoped she would remember this conversation in the next loop. Midnight struck. Rome felt nothing change. No flash of light, no sensation of movement. But when she looked at the bench across from her, Damon was gone. She was holding an evidence bag in her hands, sealed and labeled, containing exactly 2 kilograms of cocaine. Her original arrest report was logged in the system, time-stamped at 6:47 in the evening, and everything was documented as if the arrest had proceeded normally. Her body camera footage, when she checked it later, showed her arresting Damon once, processing him once, and filing 1 report. But the footage also showed her standing in the holding cell at midnight, alone, speaking to empty air. Rome filed her final report. Suspect detained, evidence logged, transfer to authorities pending arrival in Nassau. But when they docked the next morning, there was no Damon to transfer. The holding cell was empty. The evidence bag was there, the cocaine was there, but the suspect had vanished. Passenger manifests showed no record of anyone named Damon boarding the ship. The cruise card used to identify him did not exist in the system. Rome's arrest report documented a ghost. Rome transferred to a different ship within a month, requested a schedule change so she would never work the 4 to midnight shift again. The request was approved without question. She still works maritime security 4 years later, but she refuses assignments on that particular route, avoids that specific ship. Her watch stopped working at 11:47 on February 8, 2020. She tried getting it repaired 3 times. Each repair lasted exactly 1 week before the watch stopped again at the same time. She stopped wearing it, keeps it in a drawer at home. But sometimes late at night, she hears it ticking even though it has no battery. Rome sees Damon sometimes, in crowds at embarkation, in security footage from other ships, always in the background, always looking at her. But when she approaches, there is nobody there. She has dreams where she is still arresting him, still processing him, still watching him disappear at midnight. In the dreams, he tells her different things each time. Sometimes he says there were not 7 loops, but 70. Sometimes he says she never arrested him at all, that she has been stuck in the security office filing the same report for years. Sometimes he asks her what time it is, and when she checks, her watch always shows 11:47. The cocaine from that night was eventually destroyed as evidence in a case with no defendant. The incident was classified as operator error. Possible contamination of evidence, closed without prosecution. But Rome knows what she experienced. She arrested the same man multiple times in one night, watched reality reset itself, saw time fold back on itself like paper. She does not know if Damon was ever real, if the drugs were real, if any of it happened the way she remembers. She only knows that she will never work another shift that ends at midnight, and she will never trust a clock that shows 11:47. Have you ever felt like you were living the same moment twice? What if you were, and you just couldn't tell? Drop your experiences below. Gregory had been a ship's nurse for 11 years, running medical centers on various vessels across the Mediterranean and Caribbean routes. At 36, he had treated everything from seasickness to heart attacks, handled medical emergencies with calm efficiency, and prided himself on his diagnostic skills. August 22, 2012, started as a typical Wednesday on a Mediterranean route departing from Athens toward Istanbul. The medical center was quiet that morning until a crew member came in complaining of post-operative pain. The man's name was Pierce, a 42-year-old galley worker from Greece who had been with the ship for 6 months. Pierce lifted his shirt to show Gregory a fresh surgical scar running along his right side, about 6 inches long, professionally sutured, but clearly recent. Gregory checked the medical records on his computer. There was nothing. No surgery logged, no preoperative assessment, no post-operative care notes. Pierce insisted the ship's doctor had operated on him 3 days ago for emergency appendicitis. But the ship's doctor, according to the schedule, had been on shore leave for the past week, visiting family in Italy. Gregory examined the incision more carefully. The suturing was excellent. The wound showed proper healing for about 72 hours post-operation. And when he palpated the area, he could feel the absence of the appendix. Someone had definitely performed surgery on this man. Gregory asked Pierce to describe what happened. Pierce said he had woken up 3 nights ago with severe abdominal pain, had gone to the medical center around 2 in the morning, and the doctor on duty had diagnosed acute appendicitis. Emergency surgery was performed immediately in the ship's small operating theater. Pierce remembered the anesthesia, remembered waking up groggy with the incision bandaged, remembered being told to rest for a few days. But he could not remember the doctor's face clearly, could not recall the name. And when Gregory asked him to describe the operating theater, Pierce's description did not match the actual layout of the medical facility. Over the next hour, 5 more crew members came to the medical center with similar stories. A woman named Amina, 29, from the housekeeping staff, had a scar on her lower back where someone had taken a kidney. A man from engineering had sutures on his abdomen where a portion of his liver had been removed. Another crew member was missing corneas, wore dark glasses constantly, claimed she had donated them voluntarily, but could not explain why or to whom. 2 others had patches of skin grafted from their backs and thighs, leaving distinct scarring patterns. All of them remembered surgery. All of them believed it had been medically necessary or voluntary. None of it was documented anywhere in the ship's medical records. Gregory felt cold dread settling into his stomach. This was not a series of accidents or oversights. This was systematic. Someone had been performing unauthorized surgeries on crew members, harvesting organs, and covering their tracks. He contacted the ship's administration immediately, spoke with the staff captain, demanded a full investigation. Security sealed the medical center and began interviewing the affected crew members. Gregory went through every supply closet, every storage area, looking for evidence of where these surgeries had actually taken place. He found it in a converted storage room near the crew quarters on Deck 2. The room had been set up as a makeshift operating theater. Surgical lights mounted on portable stands, an operating table that looked like it came from a medical surplus auction, cabinets full of surgical instruments, IV stands, monitoring equipment. Everything was clean, professionally organized, clearly maintained by someone with medical knowledge. In a locked refrigerator, Gregory found coolers labeled with medical shipping companies, ready to transport biological materials. And on a small desk in the corner, he found a logbook. The logbook detailed 30 successful procedures over the past 6 months. Each entry listed the crew member by first name only, the organ or tissue harvested, the date, and the price received. Kidneys went for $50,000 each. Liver portions for $35,000. Corneas for $20,000 per pair. The handwriting was familiar to Gregory, though it took him a moment to place it. Then he realized with sick certainty whose writing it was. The assistant purser, a man named Gregory had worked with occasionally, someone who had basic emergency medical training from his time in the military. Gregory called security back to the storage room. They photographed everything, documented the evidence, and began searching for the assistant purser. They found him in his cabin 2 hours later. His name was Clay, and he was 33 years old, had been with the company for 4 years. When security brought him to the captain's office for questioning, Clay admitted everything immediately. He described the operation with disturbing casualness. He would identify crew members who were in financial difficulty, offer them money for organ donation, drug their evening meals with sedatives, and perform the extractions while they were unconscious. The crew members would wake up with false memories of legitimate medical procedures, their minds filling in explanations that made sense to them. But then Clay showed them something that made Gregory's medical training completely inadequate to explain. He pulled up his own shirt. His abdomen was covered in scars, dozens of them, layered over each other in patterns that suggested multiple surgeries. He had been harvesting from himself too, he explained. It started as a test to see if the procedures were safe before he used them on others. He took his own kidney first. But then something impossible happened. The kidney grew back. Not immediately, but over the course of 3 weeks, he felt it regenerating. Felt new tissue forming where the organ had been removed. Clay told them he thought he had made a mistake with his own procedure at first, that maybe he had not fully removed the kidney. But then he took the other one. Same result. Regeneration. He tested it on other organs. A liver lobe, sections of lung tissue, skin grafts. Everything grew back. He became obsessed with understanding why. He tested the ship's water supply, analyzed the food from the galley, took samples of everything the crew consumed. Finally, he found it. Contamination in the ship's water filtration system. Someone else was smuggling illegal growth hormones through the water supply, compounds meant for agricultural use, mixed into the filtration systems at specific ports. The hormones were supposed to degrade and disperse, undetectable by normal testing, but they were accumulating in the crew's systems. Gregory felt his hands shaking as Clay spoke. He demanded that the affected crew members be brought to the medical center immediately for examination. What he found confirmed Clay's claims, but was far worse than simple organ regeneration. Pierce's appendix had grown back, but in the wrong place, outside the normal anatomical position, pressing against his intestinal wall. Amina's kidney had regenerated, but there were now 2 kidneys on her left side and 1 on her right, the extra organ growing through the renal capsule and into surrounding tissue. The engineering crew member's liver was overproducing, growing beyond its normal size, pushing against his rib cage. The tissue looked wrong under examination. Too pink, too smooth, cellular growth patterns that resembled tumors more than normal organ development. The smell in the medical center became overwhelming as Gregory examined patient after patient. It was the smell of accelerated cell growth, of tissue developing too quickly, a sweet, organic scent that made him think of overripe fruit and laboratory cultures. The crew members were in pain, confused, frightened. Some of them showed Gregory areas where they could feel new tissue forming under their skin, masses that pulsed and shifted. The woman who had lost her corneas was crying, saying she could feel her eyes changing, that something was growing in the sockets that should not be there. Gregory immediately contacted the nearest port authority and arranged for emergency medical evacuations. The ship diverted to Athens, where specialized medical teams were waiting. Clay and 2 other crew members who had helped facilitate the smuggling operation were arrested. The water filtration systems were shut down and quarantined for analysis. Gregory prepared detailed medical reports on each affected crew member, documenting the abnormal regeneration, the growth patterns, the physiological changes that violated every principle of human biology he had learned. The investigation eventually uncovered 2 separate smuggling operations running simultaneously on the ship. The first was Clay's organ trafficking ring. The second was an agricultural company illegally transporting growth hormones meant for livestock, using the ship's water system as a distribution method to avoid port inspections. The hormones were supposed to degrade within days, but interaction with the ship's water treatment chemicals had stabilized them, made them more potent. When combined with the trauma of surgical organ removal, the hormones triggered regenerative responses that human bodies were never meant to experience. 8 crew members were evacuated to medical facilities in Athens. The prognosis was poor. The regeneration could not be stopped. Tissue continued to overproduce, organs continued to multiply, cells divided at rates that overwhelmed normal bodily functions. 3 of them died within 6 months from complications. Organ failure caused by too many organs competing for blood supply, cancers that developed from the uncontrolled cell growth, immune systems that attacked the regenerating tissue as foreign. The others survived, but required surgeries every few months to remove excess tissue, to cut away organs that grew where they should not exist. Gregory testified at Clay's trial. Clay received 18 years for organ trafficking, medical malpractice, and assault. The agricultural company faced massive fines and criminal charges for illegal transport of controlled substances. The cruise line implemented new water testing protocols and medical oversight procedures. But none of it could undo what had been done to those crew members, could not reverse the biological nightmare their bodies had become. Gregory continued working as a ship's nurse for 3 more years after the incident. But eventually, he could not handle it anymore. Every time he treated a crew member for routine illness, he wondered if their cells were dividing normally, if their organs were where they should be, if something invisible was growing inside them. He left maritime medicine in 2015, took a position at a hospital on land where the water supply was tested daily, where every procedure was documented and monitored, where the laws of biology seemed to hold steady. But Gregory still has nightmares. He dreams of that storage room operating theater, of the logbook with its neat entries documenting 30 violations of human autonomy. He dreams of Pierce's face when Gregory told him his appendix was growing back in the wrong place. Dreams of Amina crying as she felt kidneys multiplying in her abdomen. He dreams of Clay's scarred torso, of tissue regenerating in patterns that should not exist, of the human body becoming something other than human through chemistry and trauma and greed. Gregory keeps copies of the medical reports in a locked file at his home. Sometimes he reviews them, studies the cellular analysis, the growth pattern documentation, the photographs of organs that multiplied like tumors. He does this not because he wants to remember, but because he needs to. He needs to remind himself that the human body has limits, that medicine can violate those limits, and that some violations cannot be repaired. He needs to remember that healing and horror are sometimes separated by nothing more than intention and oversight. The last Gregory heard, 2 of the surviving crew members were still undergoing treatment, still having excess tissue removed every few months, still living with bodies that produced too much of everything. One of them sends him emails occasionally, brief updates that never quite capture the reality of living in a body that will not stop growing. Gregory responds with medical advice and encouragement. But he knows there is nothing he can really say. Some damage is permanent. Some smuggling operations leave scars that regenerate forever. If your body could heal any wound, would you want it to? What if it couldn't stop healing? Share your thoughts below. Caden had been working as an IT technician for 3 years on various ships, and at 29, he considered himself good at his job. He understood network security, could troubleshoot server issues quickly, and maintained the complex digital infrastructure that kept a modern cruise ship running. May 13, 2023, was a Saturday on a transatlantic route from Southampton to New York. The ship had departed 2 days earlier and was now in the middle of the Atlantic, surrounded by nothing but ocean in every direction. Caden was in the server room on Deck 3, troubleshooting what appeared to be a routine error, when he discovered something that would unravel his entire sense of reality. The error log showed unusual network activity. Massive encrypted file uploads happening every night at exactly 3 in the morning. The uploads were going to an external server, and the data volume was enormous. Gigabytes of information being transmitted over the ship's satellite connection. Caden traced the source. The uploads originated from cabin 9G on the upper passenger deck. He pulled up the passenger manifest. The cabin was registered to a woman named Enrique, 54 years old, listed as a Department of Defense contractor traveling for business. Her occupation indicated she worked in defense analysis, which might explain encrypted files. But the volume and timing seemed suspicious. Caden documented everything and reported it to the ship's security officer. By afternoon, security had visited cabin 9G and questioned Enrique. She was cooperative, showed them her credentials, explained she was traveling between consultations, and sometimes worked late reviewing classified documents. Her story checked out. She had all the proper government authorizations. Security found nothing unusual in her cabin. A laptop, some paperwork, business files. They thanked her for her cooperation and closed the investigation. But Caden could not let it go. He monitored the network that night. At 3 in the morning, the uploads resumed. Same pattern, same destination, same massive data transfers. Over the next 2 days, Caden became obsessed with figuring out what was being uploaded. He knew he was violating privacy protocols, but something felt deeply wrong. He created a packet sniffer to analyze the data flow without actually decrypting it. What he found disturbed him. The files contained Pentagon classification headers, naval operation details, weapons system specifications, satellite communication protocols. Someone was stealing military secrets and transmitting them off the ship. Enrique was the obvious suspect. She had access, motive, and the technical capability. Caden compiled evidence, network logs, data transfer records, file metadata showing the classified nature of the uploads. He brought everything to security again. They conducted a more thorough investigation, questioned Enrique extensively, examined her devices with forensic tools. She passed every test: polygraph, background check, device analysis. Her laptop showed normal work files, nothing suspicious. The classified documents she carried were legitimately checked out to her, properly authorized. Security found no evidence of espionage, no hidden programs, no data theft. The IT director told Caden his packet sniffer might be showing false positives, that government contractor work often looked suspicious to civilian monitoring tools. Caden insisted something was wrong, but without concrete proof, security could not act. Caden decided to catch Enrique in the act. On May 18th, at 2:45 in the morning, he positioned himself in the corridor outside cabin 9G. He would wait for 3 o'clock, verify the uploads were happening, and somehow document what she was doing. The hallway was empty, quiet except for the constant low hum of the ship's systems. At exactly 3, Caden heard it. The distinctive sound of a laptop booting up, the fan spinning to life. He moved closer to the door, listening. Then he heard typing, rapid and steady, the rhythm of someone working quickly through complex tasks. Caden pulled out his phone and accessed the network monitoring app he had installed. The uploads were active, data streaming from cabin 9G to the external server. He had her. He knocked on the door, ready to confront her, to demand an explanation. Enrique opened the door looking confused and sleepy, wearing pajamas, her hair disheveled. She asked what he wanted at this hour. Caden pushed past her, looking for the laptop. It was on the desk, closed and dark, no lights indicating it was running. He opened it. The system was off, completely powered down, cool to the touch. But his phone showed the uploads were still happening, data still streaming from this exact location. Enrique demanded to know what he was doing in her cabin. Caden stammered an explanation about network security, about unauthorized uploads, about classified data being stolen. She looked at him like he was insane. She showed him her laptop, demonstrated that it was off, had been off since she went to bed at 11. Security arrived within minutes, called by Enrique. They escorted Caden out of the cabin, told him he was harassing a passenger, warned him about consequences. But Caden could not understand. His monitoring tools clearly showed data transfers originating from cabin 9G. The uploads were happening right now, even as security walked him back to his quarters. The next morning, Caden was called to a meeting with the IT director and ship's administration. They showed him the security footage from the hallway outside cabin 9G. The video showed Caden standing there at 2:45, then at 3 o'clock appearing to type on his phone, then knocking on the door. But when they played the footage from inside the cabin, taken from Enrique's perspective using her phone camera after she called security, it showed something else. It showed Caden entering the cabin, walking to the desk and appearing to type on a laptop that was not there. His hands moved across an invisible keyboard, his eyes focused on a screen that did not exist. Caden watched the footage in growing horror. He could see himself typing, but there was no laptop under his hands. The IT director suggested gently that Caden might be experiencing some kind of breakdown, that the stress of the job combined with the isolation of being at sea was affecting his perception. They recommended he take medical leave, see the ship's doctor, perhaps take some time off when they reached New York. Caden tried to argue, tried to show them his network logs, but when he pulled up the data, it was not there. No uploads at 3 in the morning, no suspicious activity from cabin 9G. Clean logs showing normal passenger internet usage. Over the next 3 days, Caden barely slept. He reviewed every backup, every archive, every copy of data he had made. All of it was gone or altered, showing nothing suspicious. But he trusted his own memory, his own expertise. He knew what he had seen. On May 21st, in desperation, he broke into the server room late at night and installed hardware monitoring equipment that would log everything independently of the ship's systems. If the uploads were happening, this would catch them. At 3 in the morning, alone in his cabin, Caden watched the independent monitors. The uploads were happening, data streaming from cabin 9G just like before. But then Caden noticed something that made his blood run cold. He checked the source MAC address of the uploading device. It was not Enrique's laptop. It was his own work laptop, the one sitting on his desk in front of him. According to the logs, the classified Pentagon files were being uploaded from his computer. But he was not doing it. His hands were not on the keyboard. He watched his screen. Nothing unusual, just the monitoring software he was running. Yet the independent hardware logs clearly showed his device as the source of the data theft. Caden opened his laptop's task manager, checked running processes. Everything looked normal. But when he checked the network adapter settings, he found a program he did not recognize, something buried deep in the system files. He tried to access it, but his credentials did not work. He tried administrative override. Access denied. The program had root-level privileges that superseded even his IT administrator access. Caden felt panic rising. He shut down his laptop completely, pulled the battery, disconnected it from all networks. The independent monitors showed the uploads continuing from his MAC address, even with the laptop physically powered off. That was when Caden understood. He was not investigating espionage. He was the espionage. Something had compromised him, turned him into an unwitting agent. He searched his laptop's file system, going deeper into hidden directories, system files, areas normal users never accessed. He found it. A sophisticated program installed 6 months ago, hidden in what appeared to be a routine software update. The program had been designed to activate during specific triggers, to put him into fugue states where he would perform tasks he would not remember. Every night at 3 a.m, Caden had been waking up, accessing classified networks he should not have been able to reach, downloading files and uploading them to foreign intelligence servers. The evidence was overwhelming. His own activity logs, when he finally cracked the encryption, showed months of data theft, passwords he had typed, security bypasses he had implemented, network backdoors he had created, all done while in some kind of programmed state. His conscious mind unaware, his body operating on autopilot. The program used a combination of hypnotic triggers and neurological manipulation activated by specific audio frequencies broadcast through his laptop speakers. For 6 months, Caden had been a sleeper agent, working for an intelligence service he could not even identify. Enrique was not the spy. She was counterintelligence, a federal agent investigating the leak. She had been monitoring him for weeks, gathering evidence, watching as he unconsciously betrayed his country, night after night. The investigation she was conducting was not about stolen data. It was about him. Every suspicion Caden had about her was actually his compromised subconscious trying to deflect attention, to create a false narrative that would protect the real operation. Even his obsession with catching her had been programmed, a defense mechanism to keep him from looking inward, from discovering the truth about himself. Federal agents were waiting when the ship docked in New York on May 25th. They arrested Caden quietly. No drama, just a professional extraction. Enrique was there, showing her real credentials. FBI Counterintelligence Division. She explained everything. The foreign intelligence service that had recruited him through a seemingly innocent job placement program, the sophisticated psychological conditioning, the months of preparation before activation. Caden had been chosen because of his access, his clearances, his position on ships that carried defense contractors and military personnel. He was perfect, trustworthy, competent, and completely unaware of what he had become. The investigation showed Caden had transmitted over 40 gigabytes of classified information. Defense strategy documents, naval positioning data, satellite encryption keys, weapons system vulnerabilities. The damage assessment took months. Caden cooperated fully, underwent deprogramming, testified in closed hearings. He faced 3 years in federal custody as part of a plea agreement, followed by monitoring and restricted employment. The alternative was 25 years for espionage. He took the deal. Caden was released in 2026. He lives under monitoring, cannot work with computers beyond basic personal use, has to report his location weekly to federal oversight. The psychological evaluation determined he had been genuinely unaware of his actions, that the programming had been sophisticated enough to bypass his conscious awareness completely. But that knowledge does not help. Caden knows he betrayed his country, regardless of awareness. He knows his hands typed those passwords, accessed those files, transmitted those secrets. The worst part is the uncertainty. The deprogramming specialists could not guarantee they found all the triggers, all the conditioning. Caden goes to sleep every night, wondering if he will wake up at 3 in the morning and start typing on a keyboard that is not there, following instructions embedded so deep in his psyche that he may never be fully free. He avoids computers, avoids networks, avoids anything that might activate whatever remains in his mind. Sometimes his fingers start moving in typing patterns while he sits at a table, muscle memory executing commands he does not consciously know. He has to force his hands still, has to remind himself he is not at a keyboard, that he is not uploading anything. Caden sees Enrique sometimes, in his nightmares, and occasionally in reality when she checks on his compliance with monitoring requirements. She tells him he was a victim, that the Foreign Intelligence Service was sophisticated and patient. But Caden knows the truth is more complicated. Somewhere in his mind, there is still code running, still waiting for the right signal to activate. He is not fully in control and may never be again. Can you trust your own memory if someone else has access to your subconscious? What would you do if you discovered you had been living a double life you could not remember? Drop your thoughts below. Jamir had worked as a shore excursion coordinator for 15 years, and at 44, he knew the tourist industry inside and out. His job was to help passengers book tours at various ports, recommend restaurants and attractions, coordinate with local guides. December 16, 2008, was a Tuesday, and the ship was on a Caribbean route departing from Port Canaveral toward Cozumel, Jamaica, and Haiti. Most of his work was routine, helping families find the right beach excursion or history buffs locate the best archaeological sites. But that week, he encountered a passenger who would change everything about how he understood his own soul and what price a person could pay for desperation. Her name was Leland, and she appeared to be in her early 30s, traveling alone, which was not unusual. What caught Jamir's attention was her specific interest in religious and historical sites at every port. She wanted access to churches, cemeteries, archaeological ruins, places most tourists avoided. She asked unusual questions about restricted areas, about sites that were closed to the public, about locations with spiritual or occult significance. She tipped well, very well, and Jamir found himself bending rules he normally would not bend. He helped her arrange private access to a closed section of a Mayan ruin in Cozumel, coordinated entry to a church in Jamaica that was undergoing restoration, facilitated a visit to a cemetery in Haiti that was technically off-limits to tourists. At each location, Leland acquired something. In Cozumel, she took a small carved idol and what looked like bone fragments wrapped in ancient cloth from a sealed chamber in the ruins. Jamir watched her pocket these items, knew he should report the theft. But she handed him $5,000 in cash and asked if he could help her bring the items back to the ship discreetly. Jamir thought about his daughter back home, about the medical bills that had been piling up for 2 years, about the treatments insurance would not cover. He took the money and helped her smuggle the artifacts aboard in his own shore excursion supply bag. In Jamaica, at a church that dated back 300 years, Leland removed something from a reliquary, what the priest later described as a finger bone of a saint. She paid Jameer another $3,000 to create a distraction while she worked. In Haiti, she collected grave dirt from specific burial sites and stones from an old voodoo temple. Each theft, each acquisition, Jameer facilitated. Each time the money was good, and each time Jameer felt a growing unease that he pushed down with rationalizations about his daughter's medical needs, about doing what any father would do. By the fourth day of the cruise, December 19th, Jameer noticed he was changing. Small things at first. Flashes of anger that were not characteristic of his normally patient personality, impulsive decisions, thoughts that felt like they belonged to someone else. He snapped at passengers for minor questions, felt rage bubbling up when someone asked him to make a simple reservation. At night, he could not sleep without dreaming of the items Leland had collected, seeing faces in the darkness, hearing languages he had never learned but somehow understood on an instinctive level. His co-workers mentioned he seemed different, asked if he was feeling all right. Jameer brushed off their concerns. On December 20th, Jameer went to Leland's cabin. He needed to understand what she was doing, why these objects were affecting him. He found her door unlocked and entered without permission. The cabin looked like a ritual space. The items she had collected were arranged in a careful circle on the floor. The Mayan idol, the bone fragments, the saint's finger, the grave dirt, the temple stones. In the center of the circle was a journal, open to a page covered in diagrams and text in a language Jameer recognized as Latin mixed with something older. He picked up the journal and began reading. The entries explained everything in clinical, methodical detail. Leland was not a tourist. She was not a collector. She was the last surviving member of a family that had been cursed for 7 generations. An entity, something demonic or spirit or force beyond normal understanding, had been hunting her bloodline since the early 1800s, killing each generation in horrible ways. Her grandmother had performed a binding ritual decades ago, trapping the entity in a series of sacred objects scattered across the Caribbean. As long as the objects remained separated and in their original locations, the entity was contained. But Leland's aunt had tried to sell one of the objects 15 years ago, partially breaking the binding. The entity had killed her entire family since then, her parents, her siblings, her cousins. Leland was the last one left. The journal described Leland's plan. She would collect all the binding objects, bring them together, and perform a counter-ritual. But the ritual required a sacrifice. Someone to carry the entity, to trap it inside a living human host and keep it bound forever. The carrier would live a normal lifespan, but would always feel the entity's presence, would always fight against its influence, would essentially share their soul with something ancient and malevolent. Leland had been searching for someone who would accept this burden willingly or unknowingly. And Jameer, by handling the objects, by facilitating their collection, had already been marked. Jameer heard footsteps behind him. Leland stood in the doorway, her expression a mixture of apology and determination. She told him she was sorry, that she had not wanted it to be him. But he had made himself available by helping her. The entity had already begun attaching itself to him through his contact with the objects. She could complete the ritual now, bind the entity permanently to Jameer, and free herself and any future generations of her family from the curse. Or she could let the entity go. Free, let it kill her as it had killed everyone else in her bloodline. And then it would move on to other victims, random people who had no connection to her family's ancient sin. Jameer felt the rage building again, felt something moving in his thoughts, that was not his own consciousness. He looked at the circle of objects and understood on a level deeper than rational thought what they contained. The entity was already inside him, clawing at his mind, trying to take control. He could feel its hunger, its anger, its alien intelligence that had existed for centuries, feeding on fear and suffering. Leland was offering him a choice, but both options were terrible. Carry the entity for the rest of his life, fighting an internal battle every day, or let it go free and watch it destroy her and countless others. Jameer thought about his daughter, about why he had agreed to help Leland in the first place. The money had been important, yes, but beneath that was something darker. A willingness to compromise his principles, to steal and smuggle and break laws because he wanted something. That same selfish desire now had consequences beyond anything he could have imagined. He could refuse the binding, could try to fight Leland, could run from the cabin and seek help. But he could feel the entity inside him already, could sense that it had chosen him, that running would not save him. Leland explained the ritual. If Jameer agreed to be the carrier, she would perform the binding, seal the entity permanently within him using the collected objects as anchors. He would live a normal life outwardly, but internally he would always be fighting to maintain control, always be aware of the thing sharing his consciousness. If he refused, she would attempt the ritual on herself, but it would likely fail because the entity was already too attached to Jameer. The binding required the entity to be present in the host, and it had already chosen him. Jameer made his decision. He told Leland to complete the ritual, not because he was selfless or heroic, but because he understood that his own choices had led him here, that his willingness to facilitate theft and smuggling for money had opened the door to something much worse. This was consequence karma, justice in a form he had never anticipated. He would carry this burden because he had earned it through his own actions. Leland looked relieved and sad simultaneously. The ritual took 3 hours. Leland arranged the objects precisely, spoke words in Latin and older languages, cut symbols into her own palms and Jameer's, mixed their blood with the grave dirt and anointed the artifacts. Jameer felt the entity fighting, felt it trying to escape, felt its rage at being trapped. The pain was extraordinary, like his soul was being torn and rewoven with something toxic and furious. He heard screaming and realized it was his own voice. He felt the entity settle into him, not gently, but like a parasite, burrowing deep into his consciousness. When the ritual ended, Leland sealed the objects in a special container, a locked metal box covered in inscribed symbols. She told Jameer he had to keep this container with him always. Never let it be opened. Never let it be destroyed. If the container was ever compromised, the binding would break and the entity would be free. She handed him the box and a bank account number. The account contained $200,000, money she had saved over years knowing she would need to compensate whoever became the carrier. She said it was not enough, could never be enough, but it was all she had. Leland left the ship at the next port. Jameer never saw her again. He reported the money as an inheritance to avoid questions, used it for his daughter's medical treatments. She recovered fully, graduated college, got married, had children. Jameer attended every milestone, smiled at family gatherings, appeared to live a normal life. But he carried the locked box everywhere, kept it in a secure briefcase that never left his side. His co-workers thought it contained important documents or valuables. His family thought he was eccentric. Nobody knew the truth. 5 years have passed since the binding. Jameer still works for the cruise line, still coordinates shore excursions, still helps passengers find the perfect tour. But he never facilitates anything illegal anymore, never bends rules for money, never compromises his principles regardless of the offer. The entity is always there, whispering in his thoughts, trying to influence his decisions, pushing him toward anger and cruelty. Some days are harder than others. Some days he can barely maintain control, has to lock himself in his cabin and fight an internal battle that leaves him exhausted and shaking. The locked briefcase sits beside his desk at work, under his bed at night, in the seat next to him when he travels. Airport security has learned to recognize him, waves him through without scanning the container because his credentials mark it as secure transport. Nobody has ever asked what is inside. Jameer hopes nobody ever does. He has instructions written in his will. If he dies, the container must be taken to a specific monastery in Greece, where monks who understand these things will maintain the binding. He prays he lives long enough to deliver it himself. Jameer knows he will carry this until he dies. The entity is bound to him, part of him now in ways that cannot be separated without killing them both. He hears it constantly, feels its presence like a second heartbeat, fights its influence every moment of every day. But his daughter is healthy. Leland's family line is free from the curse, and the entity, ancient and malevolent as it is, remains trapped instead of hunting new victims. These things do not make the burden easier, but they make it meaningful. Sometimes Jameer sees Leland in crowds at ports, or thinks he does. A woman with her face, watching him from a distance, making sure he still carries the container. He is never sure if she is real or if the entity is creating visions to torment him. He does not approach to find out. The briefcase is heavy in his hand, heavier than metal and objects should be. It is the weight of consequence, of choice, of a deal made in desperation that will last until his final breath. Would you accept a curse to save someone else, knowing you could never be free of it? What price is too high for doing the right thing? Share your perspective below. Brooke had operated tender boats for 22 years, ferrying passengers between anchored cruise ships and shore locations that were too shallow for the massive vessels to dock directly. At 51, he had seen countless sunrises over Mediterranean waters, had transported thousands of tourists to picturesque islands, had become part of the essential infrastructure that kept the cruise industry running smoothly. April 27, 2016, was a Wednesday, and his ship was anchored off the coast of Santorini, one of the most beautiful stops on the Mediterranean circuit. The route had originated in Piraeus, the port of Athens, and would continue to several Greek islands over the next week. Brooke's supervisor was a man named London, 43 years old, who had worked for the cruise line for nearly a decade in various capacities. That evening around 9, London radioed Brooke with an unusual request. There would be an additional tender run at 11 that night, picking up what London described as extra crew from a remote beach on the northeastern side of the island. The location was far from the main tourist areas, accessible only by boat, and the timing was odd. Tender operations normally ceased at sunset. But London was insistent, said it was authorized by upper management, and that Brooke just needed to follow the coordinates he would provide. Brooke did not question it initially. Sometimes crew members needed special transport for legitimate reasons: medical situations, family emergencies, administrative issues that required irregular scheduling. He had done unusual runs before, but as he prepared the tender boat that night, checking fuel and safety equipment, something felt wrong. The coordinates London had given him were for a completely isolated section of coastline, nowhere near any road access or facilities. When Brooke asked for clarification, London told him not to worry about it, just to make the pickup and maintain radio silence during the run. At exactly 11, Brooke arrived at the coordinates. The beach was dark, lit only by starlight and the tender's running lights. Waiting on the sand were 14 people, men, women, and 3 children, huddled together with small bags and backpacks. They looked exhausted, frightened, their clothing dirty and worn. Brooke immediately understood what he was looking at. These were not crew members. These were refugees. Syrian families based on the Arabic, he heard them speaking quietly. People who had somehow made it to this Greek island and were now being smuggled onto the cruise ship. Someone had arranged this, had paid to have them secretly transported aboard. And Brooke was the unwitting accomplice. London's voice crackled over the radio. He told Brooke to load them quickly and return to the ship, to bring them to a specific lower deck entrance where they could board without going through normal passenger processing. Brooke stood in the tender boat, looking at the families on the beach, and felt the weight of an impossible decision settling onto his shoulders. If he followed orders, he would be participating in human smuggling, potentially endangering these people by bringing them onto a ship where they had no legal status, no protection. If he refused, he would lose his job, and these families would be left stranded with whatever desperate plan had brought them here in the first place. One of the women approached the tender. Her name, she told him softly, was Samara. She was in her mid-20s, and she was holding the hand of a small girl who might have been 5 years old. Samara spoke broken English, explained that they had paid a smuggler everything they had to get passage to Italy, that they were seeking asylum, that they had been traveling for months. She pulled up her pant leg and showed Brooke an infected wound on her calf, swollen and red, with visible signs of sepsis. She had gotten the injury weeks ago, had no access to proper medical care, and the infection was spreading. She was feverish, trembling, clearly in severe pain. Brooke helped them into the tender, all 14 of them, families with children, a teenage boy traveling alone, an elderly couple. They sat quietly, barely speaking, the exhaustion evident in every movement. The smell of unwashed bodies and infection filled the small boat. As Brooke started the engine and began the 30-minute journey back to the ship, he tried to figure out what to do. Samara sat near him, her daughter curled against her, and he could see her leg was getting worse. The skin around the wound was discolored, the infection tracking up toward her knee. Without immediate medical attention, she could lose the leg or worse. Halfway to the ship, in the darkness of open water between the island and the anchored vessel, Brooke made his decision. He changed course. Instead of heading to the coordinates London had given him, he radioed directly to the ship's captain, breaking the protocol of silence. He reported a medical emergency, explained that he had refugees aboard who needed immediate assistance, that one woman required urgent treatment for severe infection. The radio went silent for a long moment. Then the captain's voice came back, authoritative and clear. Medical team would be standing by. Port authorities would be notified. Security would meet the tender upon arrival. London's voice exploded over the radio, demanding to know what Brooke was doing, ordering him to maintain the original plan, threatening him with immediate termination. Brooke ignored him. He explained the situation to the captain, detailed London's instructions, exposed the smuggling operation. The refugees listened without understanding all the English. But Samara seemed to grasp what was happening. She looked at Brooke with an expression that contained gratitude and fear in equal measure. She knew he had just saved her life and probably destroyed whatever plan had been arranged to get them to Italy. When the tender reached the ship, the scene was controlled chaos. Medical personnel were waiting with a stretcher for Samara. Immigration officials and Greek Coast Guard had been contacted. The refugees were processed according to proper asylum protocols rather than being smuggled aboard illegally. London was immediately detained by ship security. Within hours, the investigation revealed he had been part of a larger network, taking payments from smugglers to move refugees across Mediterranean routes using cruise ships as transport vessels. He had done this successfully at least a dozen times over the past 2 years, bringing people aboard at remote locations and handing them off to contacts at various ports. Samara was rushed to the ship's medical center and then transferred to a hospital on Santorini. The infection had spread into her bloodstream, causing early-stage sepsis. If Brooke had delivered her to the ship according to London's plan, she would have been hidden in crew areas with no access to medical care. She would have died within days. The emergency treatment saved her life. The other refugees were transferred to proper authorities for asylum processing. The teenage boy and elderly couple were eventually granted asylum in Germany. The families with children were placed in refugee assistance programs. The process was slow, bureaucratic, often frustrating, but it was legal, and it gave them actual protection under international law. Brooke was fired 3 weeks later. The official reason was violation of protocol and insubordination. The cruise line could not publicly acknowledge they were terminating him for exposing a smuggling operation that had been running under their oversight. But privately, that was the message. London and 2 other ship officers were arrested as part of the larger smuggling network. The investigation showed they had moved over 100 refugees using this method, collecting thousands of dollars per person while providing no actual safety or legal status. Some of those refugees had disappeared after being handed off at ports, possibly falling into trafficking or forced labor situations. The operation had been profitable and cruel. Brooke was unemployed for 6 months. No cruise line would hire him despite his decades of experience. The industry had blacklisted him quietly, the way it handled people who became problematic regardless of the reasons. He spent his savings, considered leaving maritime work entirely, struggled with the financial consequences of his choice. But then he received a letter from a refugee aid organization. They had heard about what he did, about his decision to report the smuggling despite the personal cost. They offered him a position operating boats for legitimate search and rescue missions in the Mediterranean, helping coordinate pickups of refugees in distress, working with international organizations to provide actual humanitarian assistance. Brooke accepted. He has been doing that work for 5 years now. The pay is less than what he made on cruise ships. The conditions are harder. He operates in dangerous waters, deals with traumatic situations, sees suffering that never gets easier to witness. But the work is honest, legal, and saves lives. He receives letters occasionally from some of the people he has helped. Samara sent him a photograph 2 years ago. Her with her daughter, both healthy, both smiling, living in a small apartment in Hamburg where Samara works as a translator and her daughter attends school. The letter that meant the most came 3 years after that night. It was from the teenage boy who had been on the beach, the one traveling alone. He had made it through the asylum process, finished his education, and was studying medicine with the goal of becoming a doctor who could work with refugee populations. He wrote that he remembered Brooke's face that night, remembered the moment when Brooke made the choice to call for help instead of following the smuggling plan. He said that choice had shown him that not everyone in the world operated by exploitation and profit, that some people still valued human life over convenience or money. Brooke keeps that letter in his wallet. On difficult days, when the rescue work feels overwhelming, when he sees boats overloaded with desperate people, when he witnesses the ongoing crisis that shows no signs of ending, he reads it. The letter reminds him that individual choices matter, that one person deciding to do the right thing can ripple outward in ways impossible to predict. He made his choice in 30 minutes of darkness on open water, weighing his career against a woman's infected leg and the uncertain futures of 14 people who had already lost everything. Sometimes Brooke thinks about that moment, about how easy it would have been to follow London's instructions. He could have delivered the refugees as cargo, could have looked away from Samara's infection, could have protected his job and his income. Nobody would have blamed him. The system was designed to make that the easier choice, to reward compliance and punish moral stands. But he knows now, 5 years later, that he made the only choice he could live with. The price was real: unemployment, blacklisting, financial struggle. But the alternative was a price he would have paid with his soul. Brooke still operates boats on the Mediterranean, still sees Santorini's beautiful coastline when ships anchor there. The cruise industry continues without him, and the refugee crisis continues without meaningful solutions. But somewhere in Hamburg, a woman named Samara lives without infection in her leg, raises her daughter in safety, and probably thinks occasionally about the tender boat operator who chose compassion over complicity. And somewhere, a young man studies medicine, planning to dedicate his career to helping people the world has abandoned, inspired by a decision made on dark water by someone who had everything to lose. The question Brooke asked himself that night is the question he still carries. What kind of person do you want to be when the choice costs everything? He answered it once, definitively, and that answer defined the rest of his life. Some nights he wonders if he made the right decision, if the sacrifice was worth it. Then he remembers Samara's face, remembers the fever in her eyes and the infection spreading up her leg, remembers her daughter curled against her in the darkness. And he knows. When you're alone in the dark and nobody's watching, what choice do you make? What's the price of living with yourself after? Let me know below. That's all 10 stories from the depths of the cruise industry. 10 encounters with smuggling that became something darker, something that tested the limits of reality and human morality. From bureaucratic nightmares to demonic possession, from time loops to human trafficking, each story shows us that horror doesn't need elaborate settings. Sometimes it just needs the vast isolation of open water and people making choices they'll carry forever. If you've experienced something unexplainable at sea, or if you've faced an impossible moral choice, share it below. Thanks for sailing into darkness with me tonight. This is Mr. Nightveil, reminding you that some cargo never gets delivered, and some choices echo across every wave until your final port.